that he had reclaimed what was rightfully his. Knowing about the rift between Kyle and the Royal Alchemist Association, Roland had initially thought Kyle would seek harsh retribution. Yet, to his surprise, Kyle chose not to perpetuate the animosity. Having gained the recognition he deserved, Kyle had graciously accepted Bernard and the other two chief alchemists into the city of Neverwinter. This filled Roland's heart with warmth. Despite the challenging times, there were still individuals who steadfastly walked the right path. As long as they were within his territory, the kingdom would surely flourish. Roland said it was time to return. Nightingale inquired, "Has something happened in Neverwinter?" Roland shook his head, revealing that Honey and Lien had returned. Nightingale's voice seemed slightly subdued for some reason as she suggested, "There's no need for such a grand assembly for the return. It's just two people. They can have Lightning and Maisie bring them here. They'll be much faster than the hot air balloon and would reach the royal capital within a day." Roland replied with excitement, but the letter mentioned that Tilly has sent a few more new witches. The vast expanse of the sea had returned to its usual azure hue. Captain Jack watched his ship, as sailors on the masts called out commands and pulled thick ropes, gradually unfurling the sails. In the unpredictable weather of the sea, this routine of hoisting and lowering the sails took place several times daily. He thought to himself how much easier life would be if he had one of those ships from border town that didn't need sails to navigate. The witches mentioned he could buy one. Taking a deep puff from his pipe, his face filled with concern. He'd heard from merchants that such a steamship would cost more than 1,000 gold, so much that even selling him won't be enough. Breeze playfully added that in the sleeping curse, Lien's wage was calculated in hundreds of gold. The last time, the fat merchant had even considered hiring her long-term for over 1,000 gold. If just Lien was valued, imagine the value of all four of them together. Lien, annoyed, playfully punched Breeze, saying that merchant was awful. "Don't ever mention his name again." Breeze pulled her into a hug, chuckling softly. She was just joking. How could she ever think of selling Lien? Honey added that after Lady Tilly had heard about it, she'd specifically negotiated with the merchant associations to ensure such incidents wouldn't happen in the future. Captain Jack exhaled a ring of smoke, observing the camaraderie among the group. He asked, "It seems the other two don't talk to them much?" Referring to the two other witches, there was a brief silence among the trio. After a moment, Breeze finally said, "They were originally witches from the Blood Fong Association of Wolfshart Kingdom. They supported Heidi Morgan more than they did Lady Tilly." Captain Jack stroked his chin in thought. The name Morgan belonged to the royal family of Wolfhart. He seemed to realize something and decided not to press further. Back on the slumbering isle, Ashes, holding Tilly, inquired if sending Iffy and Shadow Feathers to the border town was a request made by Heidi Morgan. Tilly set down her quill and leaned back comfortably. Heidi doesn't want Tilly to be the sole point of contact with outside powers, and Tilly don't have a reason to refuse her. Ashes appeared somewhat annoyed, telling Tilly that Roland is her brother. What makes Heidi think she can hold the same place as Tilly? Tilly chuckled and shook her head, because Heidi is also a member of the royal family. The higher the status, the thinner the ties of kinship become. This is the same in any kingdom. Heidi is acutely aware of this, which is why she made this decision. Ashes realized Heidi's intentions then. Heidi's plans were clear. She wanted to compete with Tilly for Roland's support. Camilla had once mentioned that during Tilly's absence, Heidi had challenged Tilly's doctrine of witch equality on the slumbering isle. It was only Tilly's amiable nature and tolerance that garnered the trust of witches who had suffered under the church's oppression, bringing them together. However, this didn't mean that someone could mistake kindness for weakness and push the boundaries of trust. If someone dared disrupt the peace, Ashes would undoubtedly not spare them. Ashes believed it might be best to have a discussion with Heidi. But before she could turn away, Tilly grasped her arm, looking into Ashes' eyes, telling her that she didn't have a reason to refuse Heidi. The slumbering isle is everyone's home. All witches here are free citizens. As long as their actions don't threaten the safety and peace of the slumbering isle, Tilly won't stand in their way. she paused and said, sending them to the Western Territory isn't a bad idea after all. Ashes looked at Tilly with confusion. Tilly asked Ashes if she ever wondered why, at first, the Bloodfawn witches were no different from other witches, but now they're starting to stand out. Most of the witches from the Bloodfawn were combat witches. The pressure from the church used to weigh heavily on everyone's hearts, forcing them to stick together to survive. But now, with the churches on the fjord completely eradicated, Slumbering Isle has gained a more relaxed environment, and people's feelings and opinions have naturally started to fluctuate. This is a normal phenomenon. Tilly slowly stood up, emphasizing that mere suppression is not the answer. To have everyone work together as they did initially, they need a powerful enemy. Perhaps the demons, the Federation's crushing defeat 400 years ago, and the upcoming Third Divine War are all events only if Heidi understands it personally, it would comprehend better than simply hearing from Tilly. And in the border town, what they can witness is far more than just these events. Tilly opened the door and looked outside, explaining that only by going to the border town would they see how non-combat witches could also play an irreplaceable role. They would witness how ordinary people could have abilities comparable to combat witches, and see the amazing effects produced when everyone unites. Like this door, only by pushing it open could they welcome a broader world. Ashes silently gazed at the woman bathed in sunlight, unable to utter a word. After a long while, Tilly turned back with a mischievous smile, hoping her brother would understand why she chose Iffy and Shadowfeather. In the border town, Anna nudged Roland next to her, telling him it was time to get up. Roland turned and pulled her into his arms, telling Anna to wait a bit longer. After returning to the city of Neverwinter from the royal capital, they spent the entire night together. The brief separation made their reunion particularly passionate, leading to both of them being here all day. Anna, for the first time, missed her magical practice session. Not that she didn't want to attend, but Roland wouldn't let her leave. After some time, she pushed Roland away, reminding him that Wendy and the others should be returning soon. With new witches arriving, Roland should make preparations. Roland softly acknowledged, then climbed out of bed. The two dressed, and the water in the basin on the table had already cooled. Anna used her ability to warm it up a bit. Witches began walking into the castle's main hall, with Roland joining them. He spotted familiar faces. It was Lien, Honey, and Breeze alongside two unfamiliar faces. Breeze was the first to speak, congratulating Roland on becoming the king of Greycastle. Roland chuckled, mentioning that he hadn't held a coronation ceremony, so addressing him in the old manner was acceptable. Roland welcomed everyone to the border town, expressing his hopes for their pleasant stay. Breeze bowed in respect. Lien and Honey also curtsied, while the other two witches gave a simple chest salute but with cautious expressions. Honey brought up the scarves Roland had given them on their last visit. She teased that Lien wore hers every day and wanted to personally thank Roland. Lien instantly blushed and shyly said, "Thank you very much, Lord Roland." Roland smiled, telling Lien, "There's no need for such formality. Things haven't changed much since she left." Wendy came over to hug Lien and Honey, expressing that they were still sisters at heart. Evelyn and Candle looked a bit wary when they eyed the two new witches. After the banquet, Roland summoned the three of them and Wendy to his office. Since their arrival at the castle, Roland had been curious about something. He wanted to understand more about the two named Iffy and Shadowfeather. Weren't they from Slumbering Isle as well? Breeze briefly explained their origins, and Roland then understood that the witches from Slumbering Isle had different organizational affiliations, which explained their apparent unfamiliarity with each other. Breeze said Iffy could use her magic to summon cages, capable of trapping enemies far stronger than her. Even Ashes, if she didn't wear the Stone of God's punishment, would find it hard to escape if trapped. Shadowfeather wasn't a combat witch, but her power was unique. Anything she touched would become sticky. Once bonded, objects couldn't be separated until her magic wore off. Roland, with an expression of surprise, commented, "Such abilities should be very useful." How could that witch from the Wolfheart Kingdom, Heidi Morgan, agree to send someone with such capabilities over to the border town? Breeze said, the members of the Blood Fawn Association are all very powerful. Not only are there many combat witches, but the remaining non-combat witches also possess outstanding abilities. Also, she hates to admit it, but the rapid development of slumbering owes much to them. However, they always seem to see themselves as superior and often bully other witches with weaker abilities. If it weren't for Lady Tilly's strong intervention, the number of witches heading to the fjords would be halved or more. This revelation helped Roland understand the peculiar behavior he'd observed in Evelyn and Candle when they were around the Blood Fawn witches. But what puzzled him was why Tilly sent combat witches, especially when the month of the demons had ended. Reflecting on the letter Tilly had sent him, Roland remembered a particular ancient book and a picture of the demons. There were also various magic stones. An idea began to form in his mind. Could it be? Roland got into a deep thought. While it carried significant risk, the potential rewards were also immense. Nightingale, noticing Roland's deep thought, gently stroked his head and asked, "What's on Roland's mind?" Cold sweat formed on Roland's brow, and his heart raced. He hadn't anticipated that Tilly would leave such a crucial decision up to him. Everyone looked at Roland, asking, what did he mean? Roland, with gravitas in each word, declared, they will be capturing the demons. The next morning, Roland took the witches to the forest behind the castle, with Shadowfeather being the first to undergo the test. She stuck several large stones together. Nightingale remarked that Shadowfeather's control over her magical powers was impressive and that her magic consumption was minimal. Even Axe couldn't pry the bonded stones apart with his full strength. Roland inquired how long she could maintain her magic at its strongest. Shadowfeather said that if it was just about sticking ordinary stones, with her full magical power, it could last for many decades, although she had never actually tested this limit. The most significant thing she had ever bonded with was a part of the seawall on Slumbering Isle. For the first time, a hint of pride showed on her usually stern face. She recalled that during a high tide, a segment of the seawall that rose on Slumbering Isle had a massive crack. Unfortunately, Leanne wasn't on the island at the time. Shadowfeather converted the entire crevice into an adhesive bond, and by stuffing it with hempen stone pieces, stopped the incoming seawater. Without this fix, the wall would not have lasted until the next high tide. Somehow, as she narrated this incident, it almost felt like she was silently urging Roland to praise her. Roland nodded in approval, saying, "Well done." Upon receiving the affirmation, Shadowfeather's expression reverted to her usual calm demeanor. The next witch to be tested was Breeze. While Roland had met her before, during her last visit to the western region, she hadn't had the chance to stay. Breeze expressed her delight at the opportunity to revisit the western region. Roland, with a smile, replied he hoped Breeze could enjoy life in the city of Neverwinter and make up for the regrets of the last trip. Feel free to ask Wendy if she has any requests. Breeze's power was domain control. Anyone entering within 5 meters of her would involuntarily act according to her will. She used her ability, and suddenly, Carter and Axe started dancing. Breeze mentioned she could use this power about 10 times a day. Roland nodded, recognizing it was a very powerful close combat ability. Plus, the domain was invisible to the naked eye. If she got within the 5-meter radius, she could control the fate of their enemy. Lastly, there was Iffy. Her magic could conjure a cage to instantly trap approaching enemies. She could also constrict the cage to inflict fatal damage. At most, Iffy could trap 2 adversaries. She provocatively glanced at Nightingale, claiming that not even Ash could escape. She suggested testing her power on Maisie, having heard Maisie could transform into a giant beast. Roland thought for a moment and nodded. Maisie soon flew over, landing on Roland's head, noticeably heavier than before. Roland explained the test, transforming into a giant beast to see if she could break free from Iffy's magical cage. Maisie nodded happily and agreed. With a leap, Maisie transformed into a massive creature, its large body covering the sun. Roland noted she seemed larger than her initial transformation. Iffy then smirked, extending her right hand. Dozens of purple threads emerged, quickly enclosing Maisie. Despite Maisie's attempts to break free, the cage remained unyielding. Maisie laughed and said she was really trapped and complimented the cage to be very sturdy. Roland noted that this ability could also capture any demon riding aboard. Roland instructs Iffy to stop her ability. Iffy suddenly clenched her fist. The cage constricted, embedding its bars into Maisie, causing Maisie to cry out in pain. Everyone rushed forward, drawing their weapon, demanding Iffy to stop, and asking what was she doing. Iffy curled her lips and casually dismissed the cage with one hand, leaving Maisie collapsing onto the ground. Lightning launched at Iffy with full speed, cursing her for being a douchebag. Just as her fist was about to land on Iffy's face, Iffy flung another cage, ensnaring Lightning and tossing her aside. As Lightning prepared to charge again, Roland stepped in front of Iffy, raising his hand. With a resounding slap, everyone froze. Iffy, most shocked of all, stared at Roland in disbelief. After a moment, she knelt, admitting her impropriety. Roland was furious. Roland didn't want to raise his hand against a woman, but seeing Maisie on the ground triggered an instinct. He acted without thinking, feeling as enraged as if his own daughter had been bullied. He demanded an explanation. Iffy calmly stated that people often exhibit more strength in dire situations. She just wanted accurate test results. She concluded that even evolved non-combat witches were still limited, and power evolution couldn't make up for inherent disparities. Roland was flabbergasted. What kind of environment did this person grow up in to think that hurting a fellow witch for a mere test was acceptable? Roland looked towards Maisie, asking Wendy about her condition. Wendy, with a heart full of pain, rolled up Maisie's sleeve to reveal the distinct marks left by the cage's constriction. Maisie buried her face in Wendy's arms, her voice filled with a sense of fear and sadness. Iffy dismissed the concern, stating that she was aware of the force she used and that such minor injuries would heal in a day or two for a witch. Roland, in a fit of rage, interrupted her, demanding an apology. Iffy looked at him in surprise and uttered an apology, but only to Roland. When Roland pointed at Maisie and insisted she apologize to her too, this time, she gritted her teeth, lowering her head but remained silent, her demeanor clearly stating she wouldn't apologize to Maisie. Upon seeing this, Roland's anger surged. It seemed the situation on Slumbering Isle might be far worse than he imagined. If the members of the Bloodfang Association behaved this way on his territory, what would it be like on Slumbering Isle? Perhaps there was constant dissent and defiance. More importantly, the issue was that Iffy saw no wrong in her actions. Roland knew he could come up with countless ways to punish her, but that would do nothing to correct her misguided sense of morality. Recalling the purpose behind Tilly sending the witches here, he sighed. Having previously boasted about being the dependable big brother Tilly could turn to, he couldn't simply punish Iffy and return her back to the Slumbering Isle. If he couldn't help Tilly pacify the conflicts on Slumbering Isle, the unity there would crumble. While he might attract some witches to his side, he would forever lose Tilly's trust. To make Iffy genuinely realize her mistake, Roland knew he had to challenge and break the very foundation of her pride and beliefs. Roland's voice grew colder, challenging Iffy. Questioning if she thinks that being stronger than others gives her the right to disregard the feelings of those she deems weaker? Do Iffy see herself as superior just because she's a combat witch? His gaze was piercing, making Iffy visibly uncomfortable. Roland continued, in thinking that combat witches should be held in higher regard than other witches. Does she believe that in the face of external threats, combat witches are more important for the group's survival? Such a thought is both pitiable and laughable. If it truly came to a fight, her excessive reliance on her own powers ensures that she stands no chance. Iffy's eyes flashed with anger and disbelief. Iffy's voice was dripping with contempt. Questioning if Roland believes that a non-combat witch can defeat her. Roland smirked. Most members of the Witches' Union could easily do so, even those who've never used their abilities in combat. His eyes then subtly shifted to Lightning, who after a moment of realization, gave a small nod of agreement. Roland is delusional, Iffy retorted dismissively. Roland proposed, then have Maisie truly test her skills. Maisie will personally show Iffy that Iffy has no right to consider herself superior to any witch. Iffy's eyes widened in disbelief, struggling to process that Roland considered her opponent to be what she deemed a stupid pigeon. The duel is set for tomorrow, Roland declared, enunciating each word carefully, and by then, Iffy'll understand that she is not as powerful as she believes herself to be. Returning to their room, Iffy found a meal prepared and laid out on the dining table in their living room. Clearly, they were not expected to dine in the main hall today. This was unexpected. They had thought they would go hungry and only drink water that evening. Shadowfeather thought there would be something inside this food, with a hint of suspicion. Some kind of drug, perhaps, that causes endless diarrhea? Without hesitation, Iffy grabbed a piece of bread and took a bite. Shadowfeather watched her, eyebrows furrowed, asking her if was it really necessary to escalate things to this point. Lady Heidi might have asked them to assess the situation here, but she never instructed Iffy to cause a scene in front of the prince. Iffy touched her swollen cheek, recalling Lady Heidi's words about how rulers who waged wars and conquered territories should value combat witches more. However, today's events had taken her by surprise. This secular lord seemed to treat all witches equally. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The biggest surprise was Maisie. Iffy had never imagined that the seemingly stupid bird, who often couldn't even finish her sentences, was so beloved by so many witches, including the Lord himself. When Maisie appeared, the smiles of those around her were genuine. Yet, on Slumbering Isle, Maisie was nothing more than a dispensable pet. This realization ignited a raging jealousy and anger within Iffy. She slammed her fist on the table, viewing it as a betrayal. They had come to this land to demonstrate their worth, to make Roland understand their importance. In Iffy's eyes, combat witches were always the strongest, and she was determined to prove that to Roland. Returning to the room after dinner, Lightning urged Maisie to not hold back and to make that douchebag cry and beg for mercy. Maisie sat at the edge of her bed, her face hidden behind her hair, softly nodded, and said she understood. Lightning pushed aside her long white hair, holding onto her cheek, clearly recognizing that Maisie had no actual intention of giving Iffy a beating. Maisie looked at Lightning, her eyes reddened. If Maisie doesn't make Iffy cry this time, Lightning said teasingly, she won't bring the cowardly Maisie on any more adventures. Maisie hesitated, her expression even more teary. Another voice sounded from behind them. Maisie isn't a coward, she interjected. A coward couldn't have battled demons, and she even saved my life once. Emerging from the mist, Nightingale approached the bed and karate-chopped Lightning's head, telling Lightning she shouldn't have said that. The young girl held her head, admitting she just didn't want Maisie to back down when it mattered most. Nightingale sighed and gently held Maisie's hand. This contest isn't simply between Maisie and Iffy, she said softly. His Majesty Roland arranged this to make the witches of the Bloodfang realize their mistakes and change their attitude towards other witches. There are many witches like Evelyn and Candle on the Slumbering Isle who've had similar experiences. If Maisie can teach her a lesson, in a way, Maisie is helping all of them. Nightingale gazed intently at Maisie, reminding her that she wasn't just fighting for herself this time but for everyone, just like when they faced the demons. Maisie blinked and gave a slight nod. With a relieved smile, Nightingale added, Roland even said that if Maisie wins this time, Maisie will have unlimited ice cream sandwiches and pepper-grilled barbecue for a whole week, just for Maisie alone. Maisie's eyes lit up instantly, promising a decisive victory. The next day, outside the city walls on a grassy field, around 10 witches gathered around Roland. They overwhelmingly voiced their support for Maisie. Shadowfeather yawned, saying she won't be cheering for Iffy since she won't hear it anyway. Iffy slowly stepped into the designated area, looking coldly at Maisie across from her, thinking scornfully. If having more supporters meant victory, then the church would have unified the continent long ago. Mockingly, she suggested to Maisie that it wasn't too late to admit defeat now. Maisie replied with a determination that she wouldn't lose. Taken aback, Iffy wondered when Maisie had become so audacious to speak with such confidence. She scoffed, saying she'd lock Maisie up in a cage and never let her out. Standing tall, Maisie declared that Iffy wouldn't be able to catch her. The only one who could do so in the sky was lightning. At the sound of the duel starting whistle, Iffy wasted no time, charging straight at Maisie. She arrogantly believed that even if Maisie had the Stone of God punishment, she still couldn't possibly defeat her, since she had undergone years of rigorous combat training. Little did anyone know the hardships that the Blood Fong witches had been through. Maisie, in response, transformed into a small blue bird, swiftly soaring towards the sky. Iffy extended her arm in the direction Maisie fled, but her magical lines failed to hit their mark. The bird ascended higher and soon vanished from sight, leaving behind only a series of clear chirps. Frowning, Iffy looked up at the blinding sun, which hindered her vision. She sneered, guessing that Maisie planned to use the sunlight to cloak her presence. But what harm could a fist-sized blue bird do to her? Iffy closed her eyes, using magic to pinpoint Maisie's location. Suddenly, she tried to use her magical line to trap Maisie but continuously missed Maisie. As Maisie drew nearer, to Iffy's astonishment, she transformed back into her human form midair and pulled out a silver revolver from her waist. Before Iffy could react, she felt as if she'd been fiercely struck in the abdomen by a sledgehammer, followed by hits to her thighs and shins. Loud noises echoed, with dirt flying up from the impact. The intense pain rendered Iffy mute, her legs buckling beneath her, unable to support her weight. More shots have been fired, she collapsed, curling into a ball while clutching her stomach, her consciousness blurring. Through the haze, she spotted a white silhouette landing in front of her, who said, "You lost." These were the last words Iffy heard before she fainted. A raggedly dressed little girl was being pulled through the woods by another tall girl. The gravel beneath their feet was hard, and every step felt piercingly painful. The little girl pleaded with the taller girl named Annie to slow down, insisting that she was too tired and they couldn't escape. But Annie tightly gripped her hand, tugging her forward relentlessly. They were being pursued by the church's judgment army. The little girl, Iffy, shook off Annie's hand, saying she couldn't run anymore and her feet hurt really bad. With a soft sigh, Annie picked Iffy up, carrying her on her back. Even though this meant they'd move much slower, Annie was resolute not to leave Iffy behind. "No matter what happens, they will stay together," Annie said firmly. "As long as they hold on and find the Blood Fong Association, their protection will ensure their safety." The Judgment Army drew nearer, and suddenly a barrage of crossbow bolts shot towards them. Annie shielded Iffy, taking her to the ground and protecting her with her own body. The mounted Judgment Knights, wielding their weapons, closed in, now only about 10 meters away. But then, the uneven gravel ground they were on suddenly collapsed, and the soldiers leading the charge screamed as they plummeted into a deep pit. The remaining forces scattered in panic, but their horses unexpectedly fell to their knees, incapacitated. A group of figures in red robes emerged in front of the church's judgment army as if they had risen straight from the ground. It wasn't long before the judgment army was wiped out. The last one, attempting to flee, suddenly became a horrifying spectacle for Annie and Iffy. His body twisted grotesquely, with the harrowing sounds of snapping bones filling the air. His body then exploded. Following the encounter, the red-robed figures quickly stripped the fallen Judgment Knights of their armor, weapons, and belongings. They even took the Stone of God punishment. As the two girls watched these red-cloaked individuals, they realized they had been saved. Both fell to their knees in gratitude. One of the red-robed figures asked them why were they looking for the Blood Fong Association. Annie explained that they were both witches, and 3 others had been separated from them during the run. She hoped the Blood Fong Association could help to locate them and join the Blood Fong Association together. One of the red-cloaked individuals removed her hood, revealing long, fiery red hair. She stated they didn't have enough people to look for other witches. If Annie's companions couldn't make it here on their own, they weren't worthy of joining the Blood Fong Association. She added that even if they did make it, it wasn't guaranteed they would be accepted. Upon hearing this, Iffy felt Annie's hands grip tighten. The red-haired woman inquired about their witch abilities. After both demonstrated their abilities, the woman nodded at Iffy, signaling for her to follow, but told Annie she couldn't join the Blood Fong Association. Later, Iffy, donning a red robe, cried along the way, repeatedly saying she wanted to be with Annie. The red-haired woman, impatiently, scolded her, saying Annie was nothing but a burden. Iffy retorted, asserting that Annie was the combat witch they were looking for, and it was Annie who had saved her, telling them that Annie was very strong. The red-haired woman dismissively said whether one was a battle which was determined by the ability manifested during their awakening, not by physical strength. She believed Iffy only saw Annie as powerful because she was older. Annie's only abilities were to heat food and ignite wood, but the Blood Fong Association had no need for a cook. Blocking the red-haired woman's path, Iffy asked where they were taking Annie. The woman pushed Iffy aside, telling her it was none of her concern. Tears threatened Iffy's eyes again. The red-haired woman, with a furrowed brow, sternly told Iffy that their leader, Lady Heidi, despised the weak. If Iffy wished to survive as a member of the Blood Fong Association, she needed to forget about Annie and everything that had happened before. Heidi approached, inquiring about the commotion. The red-haired woman regarded Heidi with respect. Heidi glanced at Iffy and explained that the Blood Fong Association needed beasts, not weak lambs waiting to be slaughtered. They couldn't keep too many witches, the useless ones must be abandoned. Heidi then asked Iffy if she had heard of the mountain wolves. Iffy shook her head. Heidi elaborated that the mountain wolf was the symbol of the Wolfheart Kingdom and ruled the mountains. From one litter, 3 to 4 wolf pups might be born, but not all would survive. The mother wolf, based on how much she have hunted, would kill the pups that she couldn't feed, ensuring the others received ample food. Only offspring raised this way could survive the harsh mountain environment. Lifting Iffy's chin, Heidi told her that this was the revelation given to them by the gods, and Iffy had to become a beast. Terrified, Iffy looked up, only to see a mask reflecting cold light. She wanted to scream. Heidi, in a brainwashing manner, told Iffy that witches should be like wild beasts, and only such powerful witches deserved to live. Iffy felt an overwhelming force in her mind, as if every Blood Fong Association witch was repeating one phrase, "Become a beast." "Annie!" she screamed. Suddenly, she snapped her eyes open. Everything had vanished, leaving only a room ceiling and a hanging lamp in sight. Was it all just a dream? Relieved, Iffy sat up and noticed a young girl by her bed, curiously observing her. From the girl's unguarded expression, it was evident she had never experienced hardship or conflict. Introducing herself as Nanoa, she explained that King Roland had sent her to tend to Iffy's injuries. Asking if Iffy was still in pain, Iffy looked at the girl, thinking someone like her wouldn't survive a day in the Blood Fong Association. Nanoa, recalling something, guessed Iffy must be hungry and hurried out to get some food for her. Iffy rose from the bed, touching her abdomen. The pain was gone, but the humiliation of losing to a mere pigeon was something she couldn't come to terms with. She needed to understand what weapon Maisie had employed against her. Removing her clothes, her back revealed dozens of crisscrossing scars, resembling those from a whip's lashings. Looking at her in the mirror brought her back years ago, in a cave flashback. The whip resounded crisply against her back. The red-haired woman scorned, "Can't even endure this amount of training," calling all of them worthless trash. Iffy's mind wandered to memories from years past at the Blood Fong Association. She couldn't understand the likes of witches from Tilly's side, and even those from the city of Neverwinter. With hardly any capabilities to defend against strong enemies, how could they survive in this world where the law of the jungle prevailed? In the cave, there was only one piece of bread on a plate. 4 people, but just one piece of sustenance. Glancing at the bread, Iffy lunged at the witch nearest to her and started fighting for the food. In her world, much like a beast, only the most powerful witches deserved to live. Iffy was convinced that Heidi was right. Tilly's ideology is wrong, it's only because she had 2 extraordinary witches by her side. Without Ashes and Andrea, her position would have undoubtedly been overtaken. Iffy's mind went back to the days just before she left the Blood Fong Association. Heidi, in a fit of rage, had smashed a cup to the ground. She was infuriated that so many witches were willing to heed Tilly's commands. Heidi's expression darkened as she heard that Tilly said that the Lord of the Western Territory believed non-combat witches were equally important. Heidi believed these were just lies made up by Tilly. Who better than her knew what a lord or a king truly desired? She ordered Iffy and Shadowfeather to head to the Western Territories immediately to expose Tilly's lies. Heidi wants the two of them to transfer a message that Heidi was willing to offer King Roland much more than Tilly could. Strangely, at that moment, Iffy thought that Heidi didn't seem like the beast she always portrayed herself to be, but rather like an exasperated lamb. Iffy's thoughts drifted to Annie. On the night of their separation, Annie had lovingly warmed food for Iffy as she always had, taking care of her until the moment she saw Annie was knocked unconscious and Iffy was forcibly taken away. Her reverie was interrupted when Nanawa returned to the room, handing Iffy a freshly baked piece of bread. Looking into those pure, innocent eyes, something in Iffy's heart stirred. She murmured a quiet thank you. As Iffy ate, she asked Nanawa if she had said some weird stuff during her sleep. After some thought, Nanawa mentioned that Iffy kept saying she was a beast. However, Nanawa found it odd because Iffy clearly wasn't a beast. Iffy bit her lip and shook her head, implying that Nanawa wouldn't understand. But Nanawa smiled and remarked that they were both the same, humans. She added that while witches might have special abilities, King Roland had said everyone was human and all were the same. Iffy slowly made her way to Roland's office. As she stepped into the office, Roland noticed a change in the Blood Fong witch. Her stride wasn't as firm as when she first arrived, the caution and pride once evident on her face had diminished, replaced by a sense of bewilderment and uncertainty. After bowing respectfully and a long pause, Iffy finally spoke up, expressing her desire to know what Maisie used to defeat her. Nightingale pulled the revolver from her waist and handed it to Roland. Roland expertly removed the chamber, pouring out the bullets, explaining that Maisie had used a gun similar to this one. The bullets used in the duel had been specially modified to not pierce the body, otherwise, Iffy would have died on the spot. Holding a bullet up, Roland elaborated on the intricate process of its production. It required hundreds of ordinary townsfolk and 3 witches. Without either side missing, it wouldn't be possible. And these 3 witches were the non-combat witches Iffy often deemed useless. She looked hesitant, struggling to find the right words. Roland didn't give her much time to ponder, continuing his thought. While those witches might not directly confront Iffy with their abilities, what did it prove? An ordinary person might struggle to defeat a wild beast with mere fists and feet, but ultimately, humans dominated the world, not the wild beasts. Roland looked at Iffy intently, emphasizing that rather than calling them non-combat witches, Roland would prefer to call them support witches. The support witches have the ability that empower numerous ordinary people with new capabilities. Iffy murmured, but these weapons, in the hands of combat witches, could be even more useful. Roland shook his head, asserting that the difference wasn't significant enough to determine the outcome of a war. Assuming Iffy is up against 10 ordinary soldiers armed with the same weapon, how confident is Iffy in her victory? Roland could produce many such weapons daily, but how many combat witches are out here? Moreover, simply having weapons wasn't enough. To maintain their operation, a massive production and logistics team was necessary, and the role of support witches in this was irreplaceable. Reassembling the gun and handing it back to Nightingale, Roland explained that perhaps Iffy might not fully grasp it yet, but humans were superior to beasts precisely because of their wisdom. Magic was undoubtedly one of the best tools they had, and Iffy was wasting her inherent talents. Looking for a definitive response and with thoughts of Annie in her mind, Iffy hesitantly asked, "Can supporting witches truly make a difference?" Roland rose from his seat and assured Iffy that every witch had unique abilities and, when used rightly, could create unprecedented miracles. He told her with a smile that the 1st Army's reserve team would be conducting live ammunition training this afternoon and invited Iffy and Shadowfeather to attend. Iffy could see for herself what real power looked like. As he approached the door, he looked back at a bewildered Iffy, reminding her, times have changed. After a busy day, Agatha returned to the castle to find the sky had already turned to dusk. Upon opening the door to her residence, she was surprised to find Wendy waiting for her in the living room. Wendy's tone bore a genuine concern. She wished Agatha had come back earlier, at least in time to have dinner with everyone in the main hall. Agatha admitted she had lost track of time, too engrossed in finishing the latest batch of nitrogen. Wendy placed the dinner on the table, urging Agatha to eat while it was still warm. Agatha was somewhat touched. She hadn't expected Wendy, the most beloved witch in the witch union and trusted witch by the Lord, to bring her dinner. Wendy gently patted her shoulder, telling her not to be shy, and if she felt too tired, she could always ask Echo to sing her the Song of Springs. Wendy added with a smile, reminding Agatha that she too was a part of the witch union. After closing the door behind Wendy, Agatha took a moment before she walked to the table and lifted the lid off the insulated metal bento box. Inside was a three-course meal with a soup, mouth-watering grilled steak, sautéed mushrooms, bread slices, and an egg soup. To her surprise, there was also a small plate tucked in one corner of the box, half filled with honey. She couldn't help but salivate. Agatha can't believe that Wendy has remembered her fondness for sweet things. Thinking back to the decade she had spent battling demons in Takara, food had become increasingly scarce. On ordinary days, the main dishes were grains and fruits grown by the witches, and while there was meat, its supply was erratic. As for luxuries like spices, sugar, and honey were very rare. Agatha loved sweet treats, especially honey. She hadn't expected Wendy to notice that detail. Considering her status and origins, she had specifically requested a separate living quarter from Roland, much like the top floor of her solitary experimental tower. However, now, the large room felt slightly empty to her. Perhaps, living with others wouldn't be so bad? Taking out the honey, Agatha spread it evenly on the bread slice, savoring the sweetness that warmed her from within. Nightingale then approached her with a bright smile. After quickly finishing her bread, Agatha asked if Nightingale needed something. Nightingale relayed that Roland wished to see her. Agatha assumed Roland would remind her about the importance of balancing work and rest, and she responded that she'd be more mindful in the future. Nightingale winked, saying that wasn't the only reason, adding that Roland had plans to move against the demons. Upon hearing this, Agatha rushed out of her room. Barging into the office without waiting for Roland to speak, Agatha anxiously blurted out, "They can't even muster 10 fortress cannons at the moment, and how could Roland ever think of attacking the demon camp?" Agatha is afraid that Roland is making a big mistake. Roland looked genuinely surprised, clarifying that Agatha had misunderstood him. He didn't intend to destroy the demon camp, but rather, capture a few demons alive to bring back. Hearing this, Agatha's tension eased slightly. And Roland went on to describe the abilities of a new witch and sought Agatha's insights about the demons, such as the duration the red mist they carried could last and whether their blood could be used to craft magical seals. Agatha explained that a single container of the red mist could last a day. Roland then inquired if she could produce a magical seal if they brought a live demon back. Agatha calculated for a moment and said, with enough materials, an independent lab, and 20 assistants, the success rate of producing a basic magical seal is above 80%. She then emphasized the importance of having both herself and Anna present during the demon capture. Agatha pointed out that the Witch Union had several evolved witches whose combined strength with the firearms would be substantial. They could protect themselves even against the most powerful demons. Moreover, Anna could activate the divine seal twice. Roland nodded appreciatively, thanking her for the suggestion. She bowed and firmly stated, defeating the demons has been her lifelong wish. She hopes that Roland won't disappoint her. As Agatha was about to leave, Roland stopped her, curious about her strong initial reaction to the idea of assaulting the demon camp. Roland reminded Agatha of the first time they met. Agatha had once not only advocated for an aggressive offensive against demons, even to the point of capturing possible chaos beasts from their camp at any cost. Flushing a deep shade of red, Agatha was slightly shocked. She couldn't very well admit that her previous stance had been made in a fit of pique. She had once thought Roland had neither the ability to fend off the demons nor a realistic assessment of his strength. Her perspective later changed with the improving situation in the territory, believing that, given time, humanity's power would grow exponentially. She coughed a few times, claiming she didn't recall ever saying such things. Pretending to yawn out of exhaustion, she excused herself and left the office without looking back. Walking through the corridor leading to the witch's residence, the cool evening breeze brushed against Agatha's face, soothing her mood. Gazing up at the starry sky, Wendy's words suddenly echoed in her mind. Roland will one day become the king of Grey Castle and lead us to victory against any foe. That's what I believe, and so is everyone in the Witch Union. Seeing Wendy's unwavering conviction back then, Agatha felt a mix of envy and sadness. She envied them for not being crushed by the harsh realities yet and felt sad because mere trust could not bridge the gap in power. But now, she was starting to believe too. Even though Roland was just a mortal king, he truly seemed worthy of trust. Iffy returned to her bedroom and sat on her bed. Images of roaring guns echoed in her mind, hundreds of people lined up neatly, pulling the trigger at the targets ahead. Apart from the thick white smoke, she couldn't see anything. Even if she could sense the bullets using magic, she would never be fast enough to trap the bullets with her cage. His Majesty did not lie. The power of the metal bullets far surpassed the special bullets Maisie had used during the duel. Targets made of wood, 100 steps away, were riddled with holes. And the weapon called the cannon was even more terrifying. Moreover, these were just the oldest models of field guns. The first army soldier claimed that their 152mm fortress cannon was much more powerful. Thinking about these weapons, it all boiled down to one thought: Heidi Morgan had deceived them all. Combat witches are not invincible as she previously said. Shadowfeather also looked complex, clearly shaken by the afternoon live ammunition training as well. She looked at Iffy, asking what they should do next. Iffy shook her head, she didn't know the answer. Regardless of Heidi's previous intentions, it now seemed pointless, because Iffy knew that the Bloodfang Association could never offer what His Majesty wanted. The numerous support witches under Tilly were clearly more valuable than the Bloodfang's combat witches. Thinking about her experiences over the past years, she realized that her once prized abilities and power had become nothing but a joke. Except for Annie, nothing else was worth remembering. After a long time, she finally looked up at Shadowfeather, saying she didn't want to return to the Bloodfang Association anymore. Shadowfeather felt the same. Then she paused, looking at Iffy's reddened eyes. Iffy tried to wipe away her tears, but they kept flowing out. Only then did she taste the saltiness at the corner of her mouth, lifting her hand to touch her wet cheek. Realizing that she hadn't cried for a very long time. She has always been told that real beasts never cry. If only from the very beginning, she and Annie could encounter the Witches' Union and the border town, everything would have been so much different. Iffy really hoped that Annie could forgive her. The following day, the two went to Roland's office. The two no longer had their previous cautious expressions, their eyes were now filled with complex emotions. They explained everything to Roland, including the mission and history of Bloodfang. Roland asked if Tilly was aware of these matters. Iffy shook her head, telling him that Lady Heidi forbade them from revealing the past of the Bloodfang Association. And Lady Heidi rarely converses with Lady Tilly. Most of the other witches who joined the Slumbering Owl tend to be closer to Tilly. Even though some combat witches secretly agree with Heidi's words, most of them do not want to confront Ashes directly. After hearing the story about Bloodfang, it turns out that the burden on Tilly's shoulders isn't much less than Roland's. Roland silently reflected. Unlike himself, the rightful ruler of the Western Territory, the Witches of Slumbering Owl seemed more like a loose organization. Although Tilly was the leader, she didn't have the authority to dictate the actions of the smaller groups that had come to join. Furthermore, the Bloodfang Association itself was shrouded in mystery. As the daughter of the royal family, how could Heidi possibly not afford to maintain a group of support witches? It could only be said that she had never intended to take in those who she thought were useless from the very beginning. Unlike the previous witch association, which sought mutual protection for all witches, Heidi simply wanted a force of strong combat witches that could fight and die for her. Her obsession with the Wolfheart Kingdom made Roland even more cautious. Perhaps it would be necessary to write a confidential letter to Tilly, warning her to be wary of the Bloodfang Association's movements. Roland looked at the two witches, asking why they revealed the inner workings of the Bloodfang Association. Did they no longer listen to Heidi's command? Iffy bit her lip and lowered her head, saying they both want to join the witch union. Roland looked at her in surprise. Although he knew that the display of firepower would be a massive blow to these combat witches proud of their powerful abilities, he hadn't expected such a significant impact. However, he shook his head. Iffy had hurt Maisie, thus Roland can't just agree. Before Roland could finish, Iffy interrupted, asking Roland to punish her. She then began to unbutton her robe. Almost simultaneously, a pair of hands covered Roland's eyes. Iffy took off her robe, revealing her front, and turned back, to reveal her back filled with various whip marks. Roland was stunned. Nightingale immediately covered her with a cloth. Roland recalling what was said about the rigorous training within the Bloodfang Association, Roland could almost smell the scent of blood. In a deep voice, Roland demanded Iffy to put her clothes back on. Iffy looked at him fearfully, thinking Roland wouldn't forgive her. Roland suddenly felt a heaviness in his chest. After a pause, Roland told Iffy that if she wished to join the witch union, then don't bring the Bloodfang's ways here. First, apply to Wendy, and apologize to Maisie. Whether the rest of the union accepts Iffy or not depends on Iffy's choice and future actions. Regardless, the city of Neverwinter is a home for all witches. Even if Iffy and Shadowfeather choose not to join the union, they can both stay here. Hearing this, Iffy visibly relaxed, grateful for Roland's kindness. After watching them leave, Roland walked to the window, taking a deep breath. With this, the team to capture the demons was assembled, but he didn't feel much relief. Nightingale said, honestly, Iffy was lucky compared to Annie. At least she's alive. If the Bloodfang Association was the only remaining witch organization in the Wolfheart Kingdom, those caught by the church or nobles would face a worse fate. A question suddenly arose in Roland's mind: had Heidi Morgan really sent non-combat witches to other witch organizations? Witches' contacts were rare and scattered to avoid detection, so how did Heidi get this information? After all, given the life and death nature of their locations, leaders of various organizations likely wouldn't easily disclose their bases. And even if she knew, sending witches there would be risky. Would other witch organizations willingly accept these new witches? The more Roland thought about it, the more suspicious he became. However, Nightingale had confirmed that Iffy wasn't lying. So, the problem seemed to lie with the very creator of the Bloodfang Association. With these thoughts, the danger posed by Heidi seemed even more significant. Roland realized he should inform Tilly of these findings as soon as possible. She needed to start an investigation and be prepared. The daughter of the Morgan family might not truly be loyal to the witches. Nightingale appeared atop Roland's desk. Roland hoped that before they set out, everyone could rehearse a few more times in advance, becoming familiar with the entire capture operation and the tasks each person was responsible for. He stood up and walked to the window, gazing in the direction of the snowy mountains, and roughly recounted the plan he envisioned. Then he paused. If the capture operation encountered the worst possible situation, Roland hoped that they could abandon the mission and at least make sure everyone came back safely. Nightingale said she would do her best. Outside the window, Roland saw Barev's figure, knowing that Barev had finally returned from the royal capital. Meanwhile, in the royal capital, when Edith and her younger brother Cole arrived, they found out that King Roland had left here a week ago, and moreover, no coronation ceremony had been held. The two came as envoys representing their father from the Northern Territory. Upon seeing them, the guards were very respectful, informing them that Minister Barif had also headed to the border town a few days ago, and no one was currently residing in the palace. The guards told them that if they wished to negotiate with the city hall, the guards could relay the message to them. Edith shook her head, saying there was no need. She hadn't expected that her premonition would come true. Having spent the entire week on the ship, didn't dare to take any rest, only arriving here empty-handed. Unexpectedly, Roland truly intended to move the royal capital elsewhere, abandoning this splendid city to construct a new capital in the Western Territory. What exactly was Roland thinking? It's impossible to build a city of this scale without 3 to 4 decades of construction. Cole trailed behind his sister, asking what they should do next. Edith was prepared to turn around and head towards the Western Territory. Cole complained that they had been on the ship for over a week and hadn't bathed. He felt he was about to be infested with lice. Edith sniffed at her collar and detected an unusual odor. Finally, she sighed, deciding they should rest for a day and set out early tomorrow. Cole added that the 2 heads they were carrying were stinking. They finally didn't have to spend time on the ship surrounded by the terrible smell. Edith pressed her forehead, she was helpless. The Northern Territory was too far from here after all, and even though they had rushed, they still missed Roland. After resting for a day, however, when they arrived at the dock the next day, they found their ship burned down to its frame. The 2 were stunned. Why had their ship been burned? Cole waved to a passerby to ask what had happened. The passerby enthusiastically explained that a stupid person had hidden a corpse on the ship, which smelled by a rat that was trying to steal things from the ship. A terrible plague had occurred within the royal capital 6 months ago, and everyone was very sensitive to it. The plague was caused by the spreading of corpses from the church. Therefore, it could only be safe if it was burned down with fire. The passerby also mentioned the captain had been arrested and was being interrogated by the guards. He wondered if the 2 had any connection with the captain. Edith didn't know how to respond for a moment and simply said, no. Looking at the burning ship, the 2 knew that the journey ahead is just going to get worse from here. Now, they needed to find a new ship. Outside the city wall, many witches had gathered. Ahead were 3 targets. Leaf, taking her first attempt, summoned vines with her ability, hitting the target's bullseye. Next were Wendy and Agatha, both of whom used their abilities to strike the bullseye as well. During the last couple of days, they had been consistently training and preparing for the capture operation. Iffy watched the 3 of them. Although Roland had said all 3 of them were support witches who had contributed a lot to the territory, from what she just saw, they were totally combat witches. She shifted her gaze towards Nightingale. This beautiful blonde woman was even more terrifying. Not only could she enter the mist and path through all obstacles, moving without a trace like an unpredictable reaper, enough to make any enemy despair. What surprised Iffy the most was hearing about an enemy called demons that had destroyed the kingdom created by witches that once ruled the continent. The blue-haired woman named Agatha, who was in charge of the capture operation, came from over 400 years ago and was one of the High Awakening witches. The outcome of the so-called divine war would determine the fate of humanity. And these demons were hiding just outside of the Western Territory?